Imagine living in a land where you work hard, build your own communities, and dream of a better future. But every important decision is made by a government thousands of miles away. You pay taxes to a king you've never met. You have no representatives in parliament. And every new law seems to take away another piece of your freedom. For millions of people living in Britain's 13 American colonies, this was everyday life during the 18th century. What began as growing frustration would soon become one of the most important revolutions in human history. A revolution that would end the rule of the world's most powerful empire over its American colonies. A revolution that would inspire movements for freedom across the globe. This is the story of the American Revolution. Chapter 1. The Rise of the 13 Colonies. By the early 1700s, Great Britain had established 13 colonies along the eastern coast of North America. From New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south, these colonies were home to farmers, merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and immigrants seeking new opportunities. Although they shared loyalty to the British Crown, each colony developed its own economy, culture, and local government. New England colonies relied on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The middle colonies became centers of commerce and agriculture. The southern colonies depended heavily on large plantations producing tobacco, rice, and indigo. Despite their differences, the colonies were growing rapidly. Cities expanded, trade flourished, and many colonists began to believe they could shape their own future. Yet they remained subjects of King George III and were expected to obey British laws. Chapter 2. The most powerful empire in the world. During the 18th century, Britain possessed one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Its navy dominated the oceans. Its merchants traded across continents. Its colonies stretched from North America to the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. To many people, British rule offered protection and economic opportunity. The Royal Navy defended colonial ports. British markets bought colonial goods. In return, the colonies were expected to follow imperial trade laws and contribute to the empire's success. For many years, this relationship worked reasonably well. But beneath the surface, tensions were beginning to grow. Chapter 3. The French and Indian War. In 1754, Britain and France entered a major conflict in North America known as the French and Indian War. Both empires wanted control of valuable land west of the Appalachian Mountains. The fighting lasted for years. British forces eventually won. The victory gave Britain vast new territories. But it also came at a tremendous cost. The war left the British government deeply in debt. Officials in London believed the American colonies should help pay for the war that had protected them. Many colonists saw the situation differently. They believed they had already contributed with soldiers, supplies, and sacrifices. This disagreement would soon lead to a political crisis. Chapter 4. New taxes and growing anger. To raise money, Britain introduced a series of new taxes. The Sugar Act placed duties on imported goods. The Stamp Act required printed materials, such as newspapers, legal documents, and licenses, to carry an official tax stamp. Later came the Townshend Acts, which taxed products including glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. British leaders argued that these taxes were fair. After all, Britain had spent enormous sums defending the colonies. But many colonists strongly disagreed. Their objection was not simply about money, it was about principle. They had no elected representatives in the British Parliament. Yet Parliament continued to pass laws affecting their daily lives. A powerful slogan spread through the colonies: no taxation without representation. The phrase quickly became a rallying cry for those demanding greater political rights. Chapter 5. Voices of Resistance. As opposition grew, colonial leaders organized meetings, published newspapers, and encouraged people to resist British policies. Merchants agreed to boycott British goods. Ordinary families began producing more items locally instead of importing them. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty organized protests against British officials. Some demonstrations remained peaceful. Others turned violent. Tax collectors were threatened. Government property was attacked. The relationship between Britain and its colonies became increasingly strained. Even people who still considered themselves loyal to the king began questioning whether Parliament truly understood life in America. By the end of the 1760s, mistrust had replaced cooperation. The colonies were no longer simply asking for lower taxes. They were demanding a voice in how they were governed. Chapter 6. Boston, a city on the edge. Narrator. By the late 1760s, Boston had become the center of colonial resistance. British officials believed the city was becoming increasingly difficult to control. To maintain order and enforce tax laws, thousands of British soldiers were sent to Boston. Their bright red uniforms became a constant reminder of British authority. For many colonists, the soldiers were not protectors. They were occupiers. Tensions grew every day. Competition for jobs increased as soldiers worked part-time to earn extra money. Arguments between civilians and soldiers became common. A single misunderstanding could quickly turn into a violent confrontation. Boston was like a city waiting for a spark. That spark came on the night of March 5th, 1770. Chapter 7, The Boston Massacre. A crowd gathered near the Boston Customs House. Some colonists shouted insults at British soldiers. Snowballs, pieces of ice, and other objects were thrown. The soldiers stood their ground as the crowd pressed closer. Then, amid the confusion, a shot rang out. No one knows with certainty who fired first or exactly what caused the soldiers to open fire. Within moments, several colonists lay dead or dying. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Although only 5 colonists were killed, the political impact was enormous. Patriot leaders used newspapers, speeches, and powerful illustrations to spread news of the incident throughout the colonies. Many people who had remained neutral began questioning British rule. The Boston Massacre became a symbol of oppression and resistance. Chapter 8, The Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. Despite growing unrest, Parliament continued introducing new policies. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act. The law allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price. British officials believed colonists would welcome cheaper tea. Instead, many saw the Tea Act as another attempt to force Parliament's authority upon them. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group known as the Sons of Liberty took action. Disguised as Mohawk warriors, they boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. Working quietly but quickly, they broke open hundreds of chests of tea. One after another, the crates were thrown into the freezing water below. By morning, more than 340 chests of tea had been destroyed. The event shocked Britain. For the colonists, it became a bold act of defiance. For the British government, it was an attack on imperial authority. Chapter 9, Britain's harsh response. King George III and Parliament refused to let the Boston Tea Party go unpunished. In 1774, Britain passed a series of laws that became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea had been paid for. Massachusetts lost many of its rights to self-government. British officials gained greater control over colonial affairs. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these measures united the colonies. Many people who had previously remained loyal to Britain now feared that their own rights could disappear next. Across the colonies, support for Boston grew. Food, supplies, and messages of solidarity arrived from neighboring colonies. The crisis had become continental. Chapter 10, The First Continental Congress. Recognizing the growing danger, leaders from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia in September 1774. This gathering became known as the First Continental Congress. The delegates came from different backgrounds. Some hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Others believed conflict was becoming inevitable. Together, they agreed to boycott British goods and demand the restoration of colonial rights. At this stage, most delegates were not seeking independence. They still hoped the king would listen to their concerns. But time was running out. Both sides were preparing for the possibility of war. Chapter 11, Lexington and Concord. In April 1775, British authorities learned that colonial militias were storing weapons in the town of Concord, Massachusetts. General Thomas Gage ordered approximately 700 British soldiers to march from Boston and seize those supplies. As the troops advanced, writers such as Paul Revere warned the countryside that the British were coming. Militia members gathered in the nearby town of Lexington. At dawn on April 19, 1775, British soldiers faced a small group of colonial militiamen. Neither side intended to start a war that morning. Then a single gunshot echoed across the village. To this day, no one knows who fired it. That mysterious shot became known as the shot heard around the world. The British continued to Concord, where they encountered stronger resistance. As they marched back to Boston, colonial militia attacked them from behind trees, stone walls, and farmhouses. The British suffered heavy casualties. The American Revolution had begun. Chapter 12. George Washington takes command. Narrator, as fighting spread across Massachusetts, the colonies faced a difficult reality. Local militias had courage. They had determination. But they lacked discipline, supplies, and unified leadership. If they hoped to challenge the greatest military power on Earth, they needed a commander capable of holding the colonies together. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. After careful discussion, the delegates unanimously chose George Washington to lead the newly formed Continental Army. Washington was not the most experienced general in the colonies, but he possessed qualities that inspired confidence. He was calm under pressure. He believed in discipline. And above all, he understood that the war could only be won if the colonies remained united. When Washington arrived near Boston, he found an army in poor condition. Many soldiers lacked proper uniforms. Some had no shoes. Food was limited. Gunpowder was scarce. Training was inconsistent. Despite these hardships, Washington refused to surrender to despair. He began transforming a collection of local militias into a professional fighting force. Chapter 13, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Before Washington could fully reorganize the army, one of the Revolution's earliest major battles had already taken place. On June 17, 1775, British forces attacked colonial positions overlooking Boston. Although remembered as the Battle of Bunker Hill, much of the fighting occurred on nearby Breed's Hill. The British launched repeated assaults against well-prepared colonial defenses. The defenders waited until the enemy came within close range before opening fire. According to tradition, officers urged their men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Wave after wave of British soldiers advanced. Again and again, they were driven back. Only when the Americans ran out of ammunition were the British able to capture the hill. Technically, Britain had won the battle, but the victory came at a terrible cost. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The battle proved that colonial forces could stand against one of Europe's finest armies. Confidence spread throughout the colonies. Chapter 14, the Declaration of Independence. By 1776, many colonial leaders had concluded that reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. The fighting had continued for more than a year. Thousands of lives had already been affected. A growing number of Americans believed that true peace could only come through independence. The Continental Congress appointed a committee to prepare a formal declaration. Its principal author was Thomas Jefferson. Drawing upon ideas of liberty, equality, and natural rights, Jefferson wrote one of history's most influential political documents. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. It proclaimed that the 13 colonies were no longer British colonies. Instead, they were free and independent states. The Declaration also stated that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. If a government violates the rights of its people, the people have the right to change or replace it. These ideas would inspire democratic movements around the world for generations to come. Chapter 15, a war of survival. Declaring independence was one thing. Winning it would be another. The Continental Army faced enormous challenges. Britain possessed one of the strongest armies in the world. Its navy controlled the seas. Its soldiers were experienced and well-equipped. The Americans often lacked food, clothing, weapons, and money. Many soldiers served only for short enlistments before returning home. Some deserted. Others fell ill from disease. Washington understood that the survival of the army was more important than winning every battle. He avoided unnecessary risks. When defeat seemed certain, he ordered strategic retreats to preserve his forces. This cautious approach frustrated some politicians, but it kept the revolution alive. Chapter 16, the Crossing of the Delaware. As winter approached in 1776, the revolution appeared close to collapse. Many soldiers planned to leave the army when their enlistments expired. Morale was dangerously low. Washington realized that he needed a victory. On the night of December 25th, 1776, during a freezing snowstorm, he made a bold decision. Leading about 2,400 soldiers, Washington crossed the icy Delaware River. The weather was brutal. Strong winds battered the boats. Sheets of ice floated through the freezing water. Yet the army continued. Before dawn on December 26th, the Americans launched a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The operation was a remarkable success. The victory was relatively small in military terms, but its psychological impact was enormous. The Continental Army had proven that it could still fight and win. Hope returned to the revolutionary cause. Chapter 17, the Winter at Valley Forge. Narrator. By the winter of 1777, the American Revolution had reached one of its darkest moments. The British Army had captured Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to flee. George Washington led his exhausted soldiers to a place called Valley Forge, about 20 miles from the city. The army settled into a harsh winter camp. The conditions were terrible. Thousands of soldiers had no proper coats. Many had no boots. Some wrapped rags around their feet to walk through the snow. Food was scarce. Blankets were limited. Disease spread quickly through the overcrowded camp. Smallpox, typhus, and influenza claimed many lives. Nearly 2,000 soldiers died during that brutal winter, not from battle, but from hunger, illness, and exposure. Despite these hardships, Washington refused to let the army fall apart. His determination inspired his men to endure. Chapter 18. Baron von Steuben transforms the army. During the darkest days at Valley Forge, help arrived from Europe. A former Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben volunteered to train the Continental Army. Although he spoke very little English, his military knowledge was extraordinary. Every day, he drilled the soldiers. He taught them how to march in formation, how to load and fire muskets more efficiently, how to use bayonets in close combat. He also improved sanitation and camp organization, reducing the spread of disease. Within a few months, the Continental Army had been transformed. The inexperienced militia had become a disciplined fighting force capable of standing against the British Army. Valley Forge became not just a place of suffering, but the birthplace of a stronger American army. Chapter 19. The Battle of Saratoga. While Washington endured the hardships of Valley Forge, another dramatic campaign unfolded in New York. British General John Burgoyne planned to cut the colonies in half by capturing the Hudson River Valley. At first, the campaign seemed successful, but American forces blocked his advance. Surrounded and running out of supplies, Burgoyne's army faced overwhelming resistance. In October 1777, at the Battle of Saratoga, Burgoyne surrendered more than 5,000 British and German soldiers. It was one of the greatest American victories of the war, but its importance went far beyond the battlefield. Across the Atlantic, European governments were watching closely. The victory convinced France that the Americans might actually win. This single battle changed the course of the Revolution. Chapter 20. France enters the war. For years, American diplomats had sought foreign support. One of the most important was Benjamin Franklin, who traveled to Paris to negotiate with the French government. Franklin's intelligence, diplomacy, and popularity impressed many French leaders. After the American victory at Saratoga, France officially recognized the United States. In 1778, France entered the war as America's ally. This decision transformed the conflict. France provided money, weapons, soldiers, military advisors, a powerful navy. Soon, Spain and the Dutch Republic also entered the wider conflict against Britain. The revolution was no longer just a colonial rebellion. It had become an international war. Britain suddenly found itself fighting powerful enemies across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Chapter 21. The Southern Campaign. Unable to end the rebellion in the north, Britain shifted its attention to the southern colonies. British commanders believed they would find stronger loyalist support there. Initially, they achieved several victories. Important cities, including Savannah and Charleston, fell under British control. However, American resistance remained strong. Leaders such as Nathaniel Greene, Daniel Morgan, and Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, used flexible tactics to wear down British forces. Rather than seeking one decisive battle, they launched surprise attacks, disrupted supply lines, and forced the British into a costly war of exhaustion. These strategies gradually weakened Britain's position in the South. Chapter 22. The Road to Yorktown. By 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army into Yorktown, Virginia. He hoped to establish a secure base near the coast where the Royal Navy could support his forces. But events unfolded differently. George Washington recognized an opportunity. Together with French General Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau, he secretly marched thousands of American and French soldiers toward Yorktown. Meanwhile, the French fleet defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, preventing Cornwallis from escaping or receiving reinforcements. For the first time in the war, an entire British army found itself trapped. The decisive battle was about to begin. Chapter 23. The Siege of Yorktown. Narrator. By the autumn of 1781, the American Revolution had reached its decisive moment. British General Charles Cornwallis had fortified his army in Yorktown, Virginia, expecting support from the Royal Navy. But events unfolded in Britain's worst possible way. A powerful French fleet, commanded by Admiral Francois Joseph Paul de Grasse, defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake. This victory prevented British ships from reaching Yorktown and cut off Cornwallis's escape by sea. At the same time, George Washington and French General Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau marched their combined armies south. Nearly 17,000 American and French soldiers surrounded Yorktown. Day after day, artillery batteries bombarded the British defenses. The siege tightened. Food grew scarce. Supplies ran low. Cornwallis attempted a desperate escape across the York River, but a violent storm disrupted the plan. With no hope of rescue, the British position became impossible. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army. Although fighting continued in some areas, Yorktown effectively ended the major military operations of the American Revolution. Chapter 24. The Treaty of Paris. After Yorktown, both Britain and the United States entered negotiations to end the war. Representatives met in Paris to discuss peace. The result was the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783. Under the treaty, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation gained territory stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. American fishing rights off Newfoundland were recognized. Both sides agreed to end hostilities and begin rebuilding peaceful relations. For Britain, it was the loss of 13 colonies. For the United States, it was the beginning of a new chapter as an independent nation. Chapter 25. Building a new government. Winning independence was only the first challenge. The new country still needed a stable government. At first, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation, but the system proved too weak to manage the growing nation. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. There, they drafted the United States Constitution, creating a stronger federal government while dividing power among three branches: the legislative branch to make laws, the executive branch, led by the president, to enforce laws, the judicial branch to interpret laws. This system of checks and balances was designed to prevent any one person or institution from becoming too powerful. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. His leadership helped establish many of the traditions that continue today. Chapter 26. The Revolution's global impact. The American Revolution influenced far more than North America. Its ideas spread across the world. The principles of liberty, representative government, and natural rights inspired political thinkers and reformers. Only a few years later, the French Revolution began, drawing inspiration from many of the same Enlightenment ideals. Across Latin America, independence leaders also looked to the American example as they challenged colonial rule. The revolution demonstrated that a colony could successfully gain independence from a powerful empire. Its legacy would shape global politics for centuries. Chapter 27. Legacy of the American Revolution. Today, the American Revolution remains one of the most significant events in modern history. It transformed 13 British colonies into the United States of America. It introduced new ideas about citizenship, constitutional government, and individual rights. At the same time, historians also note that the revolution did not immediately bring equal rights to everyone. Many groups, including enslaved people, Native American nations, and women, continued to face major inequalities, and those struggles would continue long after independence. Even so, the revolution changed the course of history. Its story continues to be studied not only for its battles, but also for the political ideas that influenced democracies around the world. Khan Yilzian. Narrator. The American Revolution was more than a war. It was a struggle over who should govern, how power should be limited, and what rights people should have. From the streets of Boston, to the frozen camp at Valley Forge, from the crossing of the Delaware, to the victory at Yorktown, ordinary men and women helped shape an extraordinary moment in history. The revolution did not solve every problem, but it marked the beginning of a new nation whose influence would eventually reach every corner of the world. More than 2 centuries later, its legacy continues to spark discussion, debate, and inspiration. The story of the American Revolution reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings and generals, but also by the choice, as of ordinary people who believe that change is possible. The end.